All right, so once your animation is completed and you've baked out all of your simulation for your simulated objects, we want to start setting up our scene so we can render it and composite it into After Effects. Now again, I do want this to be rather simple, so you're not going to have to do all the passes or layers that we did for probably the past couple semesters when we were setting up your room environments. We're going to reduce it down to just a beauty and an ambient occlusion pass, and that's it. So I'm going to continue working here with Emma's file. So I'm going to go to File and Set the Project. And again, thank you, Emma, for allowing me to use your project for this. I'm going to go ahead and select the folder there and set it, and then let's open up our scene file. And so again, you want to grab your final file. Emma, what's the latest version? Is it blocking 6? Okay. So again, like I said, ideally, you'll do this with your finalized animation. Again, your character animation is done and your simulation is baked in. Once we get that in here, we want to start lighting it for render, and this is entirely up to you. I would either recommend having, if your character's outside or something like that, you could use the Sky Dome in Arnold, or if you have an interior space, just a really simple 3-point lighting setup. So I'm going to do the Sky Dome real quick to demonstrate that, and then we'll do I think with Emma's, I think it would be best for a 3-point lighting setup. So I'm going to go up here and open up Arnold. Now, if you don't have Arnold available, and I have noticed a few of you, the Arnold plugin gets turned off for some reason. If you need to turn this back on, if you don't see this option up here, what we need to do is go to Windows, Settings and Preferences, and click on the Plugin Manager. And then towards the bottom, if we scroll through this Plugin Manager window, we should eventually see this option here. So the MTO A.mll. You'll know this is the Arnold plugin. If you see the solid angle here, solid angle is it's the company that makes Arnold. We just want to make sure this MTOA.mll is set to loaded and auto load. Once these are checked, if we hit close, you should see your Arnold options. So if you want to do a quick and dirty sort of skylighting, again, if you don't have an interior space but an exterior, we can just go up to Arnold and go to Lights and hit Sky Dome. It'll create a dome around your scene, and then if we hit Render, so let's click the Arnold tab, let's open up the Arnold render view and hit play. Just to make sure it's lit. So that's really all there is to it. Now, something that's new to the latest version of Maya 2018. Let me stop this and let's see. So if you have the latest version of Maya 2018, I think it's 2018 it's either 0.2 or 0.4. I can't remember which. But if you have the latest version installed, if you click on Render above your viewport, you'll have two options now. You'll have Viewport 2.0 and Arnold. If you click Arnold, it'll give you a smaller dialog box like this, and if you hit play, it'll actually render in your viewport. It will slow down quite a bit depending on your lighting situation and textures, but I've kind of gotten to liking this viewport a lot just for testing shaders and rendering. That's up to you. So this is with the Sky Dome, and this would be sufficient for our rendering if we wanted. If you wanted to, we could apply textures to the Sky Dome. So if we select the Sky Dome and go to the attribute editor, you can also select the Sky Dome from the outliner here, so the AI Sky Dome light. In the attribute editor here, we have a color channel. So if you want to change the color of your sky, we could tint that, and it is going to project or cast that color into your scene. You could also load in a HDRI to this, so we could pull lighting or color information from a texture. So if you were to go to Google and just type in HDRI, you could probably just do HDRI or HDRI texture, go to images, and maybe find one that would maybe match what you're going for in your scene. Let's grab this one. And again, you do want to save this into your project folder if you're going to use an image. So I'm going to save this into our source images. And I'm going to call it HDRI Sky and hit save. And then there in the color channel, if you click this input option, we can click File. And then for the file, we'll just plug in our texture. And now it's going to cast lighting in your scene based off of this image that we've plugged into our Sky Dome. So this is one approach to your lighting. This is really quick and easy to set up, especially if you have an interior. You could play around with certain settings on this if you need it to be brighter. So there is an exposure setting. So the more you increase this, it will if we take it too high, it's going to blow your scene out. But if you do need to adjust this to get better lighting or brighter lighting from your Sky Dome, you can use this. Now, if you don't want to use a Sky Dome, actually, let me just undo before we have had the Sky Dome. Oh. Because I'm in the Arnold render. So if you don't have a light when you have the Arnold viewport on, it's going to show up black. So I'm going to hit stop to go back to the normal viewport. So just a really basic lighting setup. I'm going to go into Arnold lights and tear this out. Let's see, what do we have? We have an area light, Sky Dome, mesh. I'm not going to use any of these. Let's actually go into the Maya lights. So let's go to create lights and tear this out. So I'm not going to cover all these, so we've already done this several times before. I'm going to use a point light for my interior lighting here because it'll act like a kind of acts like a light bulb. So I'm going to go ahead and create that, and this is going to be my key light. And I'm going to position this in the room where I would expect it to naturally come from. So you do need to kind of choose where your key light's going to come from. Most lighting comes from the ceiling, unless you have a lamp or something like that. And then let's hit play again in our Arnold view settings. And so it's still dark. So what we need to do is take the settings for this point light, and let's go into its Arnold settings and start increasing its exposure. Ooh. And let's see, I'm going to stop that. So once we get that where we want it, we'll need a fill light. So I'm going to go to create. Actually, I already have the lights up. I'm going to use a directional light and pull this in and have it fill from the opposite direction of my key. And do keep in mind, so if you have an interior space like this, just remember how the directional lights work. So directional light is an infinite light source coming from whatever direction the arrows are pointing in. So it's almost kind of like, it's like the sun, where it's just casting rays that go on for infinity in this one direction. Now, if this has shadows turned on and we're coming from this direction, this ceiling and wall is going to block the light, and this light won't be permitted to cast into the room. So if I'm using this as a fill light, I don't need shadows anyhow. So I'm going to select this light and go into its Arnold settings and turn off cast shadows. If I turn cast shadows off, this light will now be permitted to come into the room because it's no longer factoring shadows in, and this ceiling, wall, and so forth will no longer block this light. So do keep that in mind if you're using a directional light. If you set it up and it's not casting light into your room, it's probably because the scene or the environment is actually blocking the light rays from coming in to the environment. Alright, so let's hit play. And I may not have to do much to this light. Let's see. It's going to take the exposure up here. And that's really it for my lighting. I mean, I know I said I was going to do a 3-point lighting setup. With this, I don't think it's really necessary. So I've got a key and a fill. That's all I want. So let's go ahead and hit stop. Let's go to our panels here and check our camera real quick. So it's going to make sure we've got a camera move. and I do. Let's go into the render settings. So once we get the lighting set up, our camera's good to go. Now we're ready to specify our render settings. So I'm going to come in here, and under the render settings, I'm going to switch the render using from Maya Software to Arnold Renderer. Let's see, for image format, let's change this to, I would do some type of uncompressed format. I would either recommend doing TIFF or PNG. I'm going to do TIFF. I'm going to leave the rest of those settings alone. Let's scroll down. The next thing we'll do here is the frame slash animation extension. Let's change this from this to, I'm going to do name underscore number dot extension. I don't like using the ones that do name dot number dot extension. When you have those dots in there, usually that signifies the end of the naming convention, and then the ending is the extension or the file type. And I found that sometimes when you have name dot number dot extension, it can confuse software sometimes. So I'm going to leave it at name underscore number dot extension, and what that'll do is it'll name the file, it'll do an underscore, the frame number, dot, and then the extension or the file type. So let's go ahead and do the name underscore number dot extension. Frame padding, I'm going to leave it 4. Your starting frame and end frame, this will be dictated by your camera move. So if you have a single camera move, I think with Emma's here, it's somewhere around frames 1 to 150. So I would want to plug that in. So I'm going to have my starting frame at 1, my ending frame at 150. Now, for the sake of time and the example in this lecture, I'm not going to render all 150 frames, so I'm going to do maybe only 10 frames, just so I have time to render something and show you how to composite it. But you would put the total number of frames in here that you want to render. The only time this would maybe be different is if you have multiple cameras. So if you do have maybe 2 or more cameras, what we would want to do is down below where it says renderable cameras. Now, since I only have one camera, all I would have to do is switch this to main camera, leave my starting frame at 1 and my ending frame at 150, and I'm good to go. Now, if I have 2 cameras, what I would do is I would start with camera 1, and I would set up the frames from 1 to whenever camera 1 ends and render that. Once that render job is done, then I would come in and change these. So let's say on camera 2, well, let's say camera 1 is frames 1 through 75. So I would key that in, and I would render frames 1 through 75. And then once that was done rendering, I'd want to come in and render my second camera. And what I could do is come down here and switch the camera to camera 2. And then up here I would change it to starting frame at 76. My ending frame would be 150. And then I would continue to render the rest of my frames from the additional camera. So do keep that in mind. I think we covered this when we did that car commercial. I can't even remember now. Was that last semester? No, that was 2 semesters ago. So that was a year ago. But let's go ahead, and I'm going to start frame 1, and I'm just going to do 10 frames so I can render something real quick. So do make sure you select your camera from this drop list. I've made this mistake a handful of times, and it's always frustrating. If you forget to set this and you have it set to like back camera or perspective, you let it go through the render and then you load it and you realize your camera's looking at a wall the entire time. It's probably because we didn't set or specify the camera from here. So do make sure you render from the camera that we want to render from. So I'm going to switch that to the main camera. For the image size, you guys will be rendering this at 1920 by 1080 at 24 frames per second. So let's make sure we change this to HD 1080. And that's really it here. The only other thing you might want to do here is switch over to the Arnold. Well, I guess we'll need to do the AOVs too, but the next thing we'll want to do is click on the Arnold tab. And down here, or I guess at the top, this is where we get our render quality settings. Now, some of the stuff you may not need, and what you could do to improve your render time is maybe reduce some of these values or key them to 0. So with Emma's scene here, we have no volume or indirect lighting, so if you have like fog light and that kind of stuff, you would want to leave this here. But with Emma's scene, I don't think we really have any of that, so I'm going to key in a 0. SSS is subsurface scattering, so that's when we have an object that is translucent and it allows light to pass through it and scatter and bounce out. So if you can think of like wax or human skin, if you're using a shader with subsurface scattering, you'll want to leave this alone. Odds are, though, you're not. So let's go ahead and key that to 0. Transmission is if you have transparency. So if you have glass or anything like that, you'll want to leave that on. If you don't, key it to 0. Specularity is if you have reflective surfaces with highlights. So again, if you don't have those, you could get rid of this. Diffuse you need, and the camera AA or anti-aliasing you do need. I'm going to leave everything else on. I'm just going to turn off subsurface scattering and volume indirect. If I wanted to increase the render settings a little bit, what I might do is take my anti-aliasing up to 4 and my diffuse to 3, and that's really it. The render quality on this, I'm not going to be as particular about, like with the previous finals that we've done for the last 2 semesters. So I'm just going to leave that there. So 4, 3, 2, and 2. The next thing we need to do is set up our AOVs. So I'm going to switch on over to the AOV tab, and like I said, we only need two passes: beauty and ambient occlusion. So under the AOVs here on the left hand or the left column here, I'm going to look for diffuse. I'm going to highlight it, and then let's hit this double arrow button here to put it over to the right. And then the last one we need is a ambient occlusion, and so this is a custom pass. So I'm going to hit add custom here to create a custom pass. In the dialog box here, or the field, I'm going to type in AO for ambient occlusion and hit create. And down below, it's going to list all of your active AOVs. And so right now we should have ambient occlusion and diffuse. Now I do need to fix the ambient occlusion. So to the far right there's a little arrow pointing down. I'm going to click on that for the AO, and I'm going to click select AOV node. Over to the right in the attribute editor, you should now have the ambient occlusion AOV tab, and we want to look for the shader input. So right here we have shader, and what we want to do is put a shader override so that it will cast ambient occlusion on everything in our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and click the input here for the shader. In the create render node dialog box here, let's click on the left column here. Let's click on shader underneath Arnold, and then on the right column here we have the AI ambient occlusion. I'm going to go ahead and select that and plug that in, and let's I'm just going to make sure that actually plugged in. So to double check that, I'm going to go back here to my AOVs and click this arrow for the ambient occlusion and select that node again. And then just look at the shader input, and it should have loaded AI ambient occlusion. And if I click this input node here, this box, it should take me to the shader again so I can adjust the settings. Now, I do want to test this render, so let's hit, I'm actually going to do this in the Arnold render view. So I'm going to click the Arnold tab up here. I'm going to click on the eyeball icon to bring up the Arnold render view, and let's hit play to render. And in the top left-hand corner, I'm going to click on Beauty. And in this drop list, we should have AO and Diffuse. I'm going to click on AO for ambient occlusion. And that actually doesn't look bad. So I'm going to hit Escape to stop rendering. Now you do want to adjust your ambient occlusion shader. It doesn't always look good out of the gate, so you might have to adjust some of the settings. If you do, again, just select the shader. So if we go back here to our AOVs and click this down arrow and click the AOV node, and then let's go into the shader here. You'll want to play with things like the spread and the fall off. So the spread dictates the sort of the gradation that's happening here on the corners and edges. So you can see here it's kind of gradating outwards. We have this kind of gray, and it eventually turns to a more of a solid white. So this is coming from that spread, and then fall off is sort of the overall effect. Now this you do want to kind of play with a little bit, and you want to do it incrementally in very small amounts. So you'll notice there with the fall off, I took it from 0 to 0.1. I probably don't want the fall off to happen that quick, so I'm going to maybe do 0.05. That's actually not bad. I think I'm gonna do 0.05 on this. But the idea is just to get enough of the shading that's happening on these objects so that they look like they're near one another, and we don't want a ton of sort of gradation happening through the scene here with this gray value. So that looks pretty good. I'm gonna stop that. And that's really it for our passes. Let's go into the render layers now. So I'm going to click this clacker icon with the stack of layers on it. And really, there's nothing we need to do here other than we need to make sure the whole scene is rendering. So I'm just going to make sure the eyeball icon is there and the clacker icon, both of these are highlighted blue. That's it. So not a whole lot of setup to this. I'm going to go ahead and close all this out. The only other thing you might do is assign shaders with color information to break up your scene. So, with Emma's character here, we could assign specific shaders to the character, so like the pants and everything. It's kind of broken up in a way I could very easily assign shaders. So I'm going to go to my perspective camera and maybe right click on these pants and go down to assign new material. If you're doing flat color, you could just load Lamberts into this if you wanted to, or you could go into Arnold Shader and do a Arnold standard surface. Either way, I'm going to use a Lambert though, so I'm going to go ahead and create Lambert. We could name it, so I'm going to call it pants underscore Lambert. And I don't require that you texture or UV anything, but if you do want to sort of break up the information in your scene so it's maybe a little more interesting to look at than just a bunch of gray geometry, you could just start applying color information. So if I were to come in and maybe we're wearing blue jeans, and then I could select the shirt and assign a new favorite material and load a Lambert in here, and then we'll call this shirt Lambert, and then change the color there. And so you could just go through like this and apply shaders. Now, if you do have glass, I would recommend using an Arnold standard surface for glass. Don't use a Maya shader for that because you're not going to get as accurate of a result, or it may not work at all. So again, if you are using something where you do want specularity or transparency, use the actual Arnold shader. But if you're just looking at flat color, a Lambert will be okay. And let's actually render that just to see what it looks like. Yeah. Yeah. And so you can see here, just that little bit of color kind of helps. So let me stop that. Something else you can do, don't forget that you can actually select faces and apply shaders to specific faces on a geometry. So let's say the shirt, for example. I could right click and go to face mode. And even though the shirt already has a Lambert on it, I can grab these faces and I can apply a shader just to these faces. So if you need to break up the color information a little more on a geometry, or you need multiple shaders on one geometry, this is one way to do it. But again, I don't require UV or texture anything, but this could help with your render. So once we get this set up, I'm going to switch back over to my main camera. Just want to make sure through the resolution gate it still looks okay. And once we verified everything is good, we've set up our render settings, everything has shaders, our lighting's good, we're going to batch. So I'm going to go up here to the submenus, and I'm going to switch this over to rendering. I'm going to go up to renderer, and down here I'm just going to click batch render. Now with Arnold, you don't get options for batch render. So if you were to click on this options box, it's not going to nothing's going to happen. So just hit batch render. I'll hit allow access and hit continue. And then if we want to actually watch this, if you click the icon down here in the bottom right hand corner for the script editor, it should pull up the script editor, and in the top here it's going to read this line, rendering with Arnold renderer. We're going to give it a second, and eventually once it loads our scene into the render engine, it's going to start rendering all of our specified frames. So in this case it should only render 10 frames. And again, you know what frame it's on if you look at your, once it actually starts rendering, if you follow the line here at the end, it'll show you the frame number. So here at the end it says 001.tiff. So this is frame 1. And then if you look a little further here to the left, it's actually showing you the percentage complete. So it's around 80% done right now. And so I'm just going to wait for this to kick out 10 frames so that we can quickly composite it in After Effects. So I'm going to pause the video and we'll wait for this to finish. All right, we got our renders done. Let's go find them. And so here under our project folder, under images, we should have our ambient occlusion folder with all 10 of our images. And then we should have our diffuse. And now we're ready just to throw these into After Effects. So this should be relatively easy since we only have the 2 passes. So I'm going to open up After Effects and I'm going to double click here in my asset bin and let's bring in our image sequences. So I'm going to double click and let's go to the M drive. Where's our project folder? Images. Let's grab ambient occlusion. I'm going to click on the very first image in the sequence. Down below, I'm going to make sure it's set as import as footage. I'm going to make sure it's importing as a TIFF sequence or PNG if you rendered as PNG. But I'm going to make sure that image sequence is turned on and hit import. I'm going to hit OK. And then by default, After Effects likes to import your image sequences at 30 frames per second. Let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to go to Interpret Footage Main. And here where it says assume this frame rate, let's just key in 24 and hit OK. And then let's click on that. I'm going to hit enter on it and rename it AO. And then I'm going to double click here in the control panel one more time. And let's go to our beauty. Let's click on that. First frame as footage, as sequence. Hit import. OK. I'm going to right click and hit interpret footage main. And I'm going to key in 24 frames and hit OK. The next thing we want to do is create a comp that's as long as our animation. So again, the minimum was 5 seconds. So let's go up here to composition, new comp. Up at the top, I'm going to call it main comp. I'm going to switch the preset here from HD 1080 at 29.97 to HD 1080 at 24 frames per second. And then down below where it says duration, you'll want to change this for the actual duration of your animation. So if you did 10 seconds, go ahead and key in 10 seconds. Like I said, the minimum would be 5, so we could type in 0.5. Now I only have 10 frames, so it's not even a second, but I'm just going to key in 1 second and hit OK. And then let's drag our footage down here. So I'm going to take this this sequence here. I actually forgot to name this one. I'm going to click on it to highlight it. I'll hit enter on my keyboard and we'll call it beauty. And let's take this beauty pass and left click and drag it down below. And then let's take our ambient occlusion and drag that layer directly on top of our beauty layer. And then to combine these, let's if you don't see your blend mode options here in your timeline, you can either hit F4 on your keyboard to toggle your settings, or you can click this button here at the bottom to toggle. Once we see the blend modes, I'm going to take the ambient occlusion layer and switch its blend mode from normal to multiply. And that's it. Once we're done, we'll want to render this. Now, because I only have 10 frames, I'm going to adjust my playback range. So again, the playback range is dictated by this light gray bar above your timeline. On the far left and far right of this playback range, you should have solid blue lines or bars, and those dictate the starting and end of your playback range. So I'm going to come down here and grab the one at the end, and I'm going to cue this up to end where my footage ends. And then the one on the far left should stay where it's at because I want it to start where my footage starts. And once we get our playback range updated, all we have to do at this point is render. So I'm going to go up to File. Let's go to Export and add to Adobe Media Encoder Queue. Now, Media Encoder will load. Sometimes it takes a while to load the render job, but it should show up in the queue eventually. Once it appears there, I'm going to click on H.264. In the export settings here, let's change the output name. So I'm going to click on the blue text. Let's save this into our project folder. So let's go find our project folder. I'm going to open up Movies, and I'm going to save it directly into the Movies folder. And I'm going to call this, stick with our naming convention. So we'll do last name, first name, underscore, final. Hit save. We'll export video and audio if you need it. Let's see. Presets, let's actually change this. So where it says match source, I'm going to click that and drop down to Vimeo 1080 HD. And the rest of this should be okay. So I'm going to hit OK. And then up at the top right hand corner, I'll hit that green render button, or that playback button. We'll wait for it to render. Once the job disappears here from the bottom, we should be able to hop onto the M drive. Let's go find our project folder under Movies and open up our video here just to make sure it rendered okay. And it's only 10 frames, so it's a pretty quick animation. So this is what you guys are turning in. I don't need your project folder. I don't need your scene file. All I want is your final rendered video. And this is what will be due a week from today. You will turn this in by noon. So this is what is due for your final Monday. So after the weekend here, we will have a progress critique. And so your animation on your character should be done by Monday, and then hopefully your simulation is already on the way, if not completed. So we'll have a progress critique on Monday. It's our last meeting time. We will not meet for the final. You'll just submit your final rendered video to Astar, and that will be it. So I'll stop here.